The scent of fresh sawdust, mixed with something far less pleasant, drifted through the air as Megan knelt on the dusty kitchen floor. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, her gloved hands trembling slightly as she glanced toward Travis, who was inspecting the support beams behind the wall they'd just knocked down. "This house is a gold mine," he had said when they first toured the place. And in some ways he was right. The old two-story colonial on the outskirts of Chicago had sat vacant for over a decade. The price had been too good to pass up, especially for two newlyweds determined to build a life from scratch, literally. But now, barely 3 days into renovations, they were both beginning to wonder what they had actually bought into. It had started with the floor. The boards near the center of the kitchen felt soft and uneven, like the ground beneath them was shifting. Megan had assumed it was just moisture damage. Old houses did that. But when Travis pried up the first plank, a sharp, foul odor shot up like a wave. "Is that mold?" Megan had asked, her voice already rising with anxiety. Travis didn't answer. His expression had changed, his brow furrowed, eyes narrowed as he leaned closer to the dark, hollowed space beneath the floor. He reached down with a flashlight, angling it to the side. "What the hell?" he muttered. He moved a few more boards, one at a time, with cautious precision. That's when he saw it, what looked like the curve of a rib cage, pale and brittle against the dirt. They both froze. The silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the soft creak of the house around them. Megan's mouth went dry. She crouched beside him, peering down into the hole. "Is that bone?" Travis nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Yeah, it is." She backed away instinctively, heart thudding in her chest. Her breath caught as her mind jumped to the only logical conclusion, and it wasn't good. Travis called 911 immediately. Within the hour, flashing lights lit up their quiet street as detectives and forensic investigators cordoned off the property. Megan watched from the driveway, arms wrapped tightly around herself, as specialists carefully extracted the remains. It wasn't just one skeleton, it was several. That night, Detective Dana Wilkes stared down at the first bag of recovered bones, her jaw clenched and fingers gripping the edge of her notepad. The address was burned into her memory the moment she saw it. "Halbert Residence," she whispered to herself. 16 years. She hadn't thought about the Halbert case in years. A cold case, they'd called it. One of those quiet suburban disappearances that slipped through the cracks when no clear evidence ever surfaced. No blood, no signs of struggle, just a family that had ceased to exist. The parents, James and Lynn Halbert, their 2 kids, Tyler and Chloe, gone without a trace in 2008. The file still sat in the archive, buried under newer, noisier crimes. But Wilkes had never forgotten. Something about that house had never felt right. Back at the station, the call came through from forensics. Preliminary analysis confirmed. Human remains, 2 adults, 1 adolescent, 1 child. The dates were consistent with decomposition from the late 2000s. There were no IDs yet, but it didn't matter. She already knew. Across the street, Megan sat on the porch steps, unable to go back inside. Her hands shook as she stared at the darkened windows of the home. The place she and Travis were supposed to turn into a sanctuary was now a crime scene. A grave. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "Are you okay? I saw the news. They're saying it might be a whole family." Megan didn't answer. She couldn't. The image of those bones, white, fragmented, dry, was still burned into her brain. And beneath that kitchen floor, under layers of wood and dust and time, something darker had been hiding. Travis stood beside her, his face pale. This isn't just some old mystery," he said, barely above a whisper. "Someone did this." Megan didn't respond. She only nodded, staring straight ahead into the Chicago night. The summer of 2008 had been hot and restless in the quiet Chicago suburb of Hillside View. Neighbors trimmed hedges and watered lawns, kids rode bikes down the sidewalks, and the Halberts were knee-deep in remodeling their home at 1142 Ashgrove Lane. James Halbert, a 42-year-old accountant with a stiff posture and thinning hair, had been excited about the renovation. He often talked about building value into the property, something stable for his family. His wife, Lynn, 38, more reserved and soft-spoken, seemed less thrilled but supportive. Their children, 15-year-old Tyler and 8-year-old Chloe, reacted in ways that reflected their ages. Tyler complained constantly about the noise and chaos, while Chloe, quiet and observant, drew pictures of the workers and the changing house. They had just finished installing new cabinets when everything stopped. The last confirmed sighting of the Halbert family was on August 12th. A neighbor recalled Lynn standing in the driveway, arms crossed, speaking with a man in a red pickup truck. Another said she saw James helping a contractor carry tiles into the garage. That evening, the house went silent. No lights, no activity. The following morning, a delivery driver knocked several times before leaving a stack of bathroom tiles on the front step. By the third day, the tiles were still there. When a family friend called the police for a wellness check, officers found the front door locked and no sign of the Halberts inside. No one answered calls or texts. The car was still in the driveway. Mail piled up in the box. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Nothing seemed overtly wrong at first. The living room was tidy. The kitchen smelled of fresh paint and cut wood. Upstairs, the children's rooms looked undisturbed, but detectives noted strange details. A half-packed suitcase in the master bedroom, a forgotten grocery bag on the counter, the family's dog missing. Their phones were on the dining table, powered off. The security system had been turned off manually from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no blood, no overturned furniture. It was as if the Halberts had simply walked out of their lives in the middle of a task and never returned. But no ATM transactions, no passport activity, and no sightings ever emerged. The police questioned everyone, friends, neighbors, school officials, even extended family. No one had any real insight. The contractors, including a man named Rick Morales, gave vague statements about delays in the project. Rick said the Halberts told him they were taking a break from the renovation and would call him when they were ready to resume. No call ever came. A week turned into a month. Leads went cold. Flyers with the family's faces were posted across town, on gas station windows and telephone poles. Candlelight vigils were held. Speculation swirled. Had James run off with his family to escape debt? Did Lynn snap under stress and flee? Was it a kidnapping? Theories blossomed, but evidence was thin. The case made local headlines, then faded quietly. By 2009, the house was repossessed by the bank. Furniture was sold, walls painted over. The house was listed as abandoned by 2010. Detective Dana Wilkes, lead on the case, never let it go. She kept a photo of Chloe Halbert on the bulletin board in her office. The girl's wide, thoughtful eyes haunted her. She reread the files every year on the anniversary of the disappearance. But with no witnesses, no bodies, and no clear motive, the Halberts became just another tragic mystery. Some neighbors moved away. Others stopped talking about it. The house stood empty, a shell of middle-class normalcy hiding something much darker. 16 years later, the silence was finally broken. And though Megan and Travis had no idea what they'd walked into when they bought that house, one thing was certain now: the Halberts hadn't just vanished, they had never left. James Halbert was a man of routine. Every morning at 6 a.m., he brewed coffee, read the financial section of the Tribune, and reviewed spreadsheets before driving to his midtown office. On the outside, he was ordinary: conservative haircut, pressed shirts, always punctual. But behind his composed demeanor, James was quietly unraveling. He had accumulated debt from failed investments and poker nights that had gone too far. His savings had dwindled. He'd taken out a second mortgage without telling Lynn, and when the calls from creditors started to come late at night, he unplugged the landline. Lynn Halbert had noticed the cracks. She wasn't naive, but she was tired. A former school counselor, she had taken a leave of absence a year prior to focus on her family, but she rarely spoke about her own past. She had once lived under a different name, something not even James fully understood. A name she changed after a troubled childhood and a series of toxic relationships she refused to revisit. That past didn't come up often until the letters started arriving. They were unsigned, printed in all caps, and slid under the door or tucked into the mailbox at odd hours. "We know who you are. You can't run from the truth. You took something that wasn't yours." Lynn kept them hidden in a folder between cookbooks in the pantry. Not even James knew about them. Their son Tyler, teetering on the edge of adolescence, hated everything about the move. He resented leaving his old friends, his school, his sense of freedom. The construction noise, the endless boxes, the sterile walls, it all drove him deeper into himself. He became withdrawn, angry. He started sneaking out at night, smoking cigarettes behind the garage. One evening, Lynn caught him with a crowbar, breaking tiles in the hallway. "I hate this house," he had said, eyes burning. "It feels wrong." Chloe, on the other hand, was quiet, always drawing. She carried a sketchbook everywhere, filling pages with pencil outlines of their home. She drew the contractors, the kitchen tiles, the cracks in the ceiling. Her drawings grew darker as the summer wore on. Where once there were sunny windows and flower beds, now there were shadows, blacked-out eyes and figures watching from behind walls. In one sketch, a man stood over the family as they sat at dinner, his face scribbled out, hands red. James had brushed it off. "Kids draw weird things," he said. But Lynn knew better. In late July, tensions peaked. James confessed his debts to Lynn. She was furious, not only because of the money, but because of the secrets. They argued for hours in the garage. Tyler overheard everything and disappeared for the night. Chloe cried herself to sleep. Days later, Lynn received the final letter. It read only, "I'm coming." She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she packed bags and hid them in the trunk. She told Chloe to keep her sketchbook close. She withdrew cash and left it in the pantry, tucked beneath the cereal boxes. She tried to talk to James, but he refused to hear it. He said the renovations were almost done. They'd rent out the basement. They'd recover. But something in Lynn's face told a different story. She had started to watch people more closely, especially Rick, the contractor. He stayed late even when James wasn't home. He'd smile too long, ask about the kids, let his eyes linger. She didn't trust him. And when she found Chloe's sketch of Mr. Rick standing in the kitchen with a hammer behind his back, her hands began to shake. She asked James to fire him. James refused. "We need to finish the job," he said. "Just 2 more weeks." Lynn didn't believe they had that much time. In early August, she wrote a note to herself on the back of a grocery list. "If anything happens, check the basement. Chloe knows." That note was never found. Rick Morales had a smile that disarmed people. He wore worn jeans, steel-toed boots, and a navy hoodie with the sleeves always pushed to his elbows. His voice was smooth, relaxed, tinged with a Chicago accent that made clients feel like he was one of them. He called everyone boss or miss, and rarely showed frustration, even when delays piled up. Most homeowners liked him, said he worked fast, said he was affordable, said he was always around. Too around. The Halberts hired Rick in April 2008, after finding his ad stapled to a grocery store bulletin board. Morales Home Repair. Reliable, local, honest. He offered them a deal they couldn't pass up. Full kitchen and basement remodel for 30% less than the next lowest bid. James, already watching every dollar, jumped at the opportunity. From the start, Rick impressed. He showed up early, stayed late, worked with his hands. But it wasn't long before Lynn noticed the cracks beneath the charm. Sometimes he'd show up alone when his team was supposed to be with him. Other times, he'd leave tools behind, returning in the evening to grab something, then linger in the driveway talking to James. He took long breaks. He'd disappear for hours, then return sweaty, jittery with the smell of cigarettes and gasoline on his clothes. The other workers stopped coming after June. When asked, Rick said they quit. "Too hot," he joked. "Can't handle real work." By July, it was just Rick and the Halberts. Neighbors remember him differently. One said he seemed too familiar with Lynn. Another claimed he saw Rick inside the Halbert house on a Sunday when no work was scheduled. A third said he saw Rick arguing with James in the backyard, tools clattering as voices rose. But back then, none of it was reported. When the Halberts disappeared in August, Rick told police he had last seen them the week before. He said James called to cancel the remaining work and asked for time to deal with family stuff. Rick said he assumed they went on vacation, that they probably had money trouble and skipped town. The statement was vague, but without proof of wrongdoing, police let him go. Rick's company, Morales Home Repair, dissolved less than a year later. The listed phone number stopped working. His listed address turned out to be a rented apartment he had vacated months earlier. He didn't have a website, no social media. He paid most of his workers in cash. He vanished like smoke. By 2010, Rick Morales had effectively disappeared. Detective Dana Wilkes always suspected him. He was the last person confirmed to be in the Halbert home. He knew the layout. He had keys. But without bodies or a crime scene, nothing stuck. They pulled his tax records, criminal background, nothing. Clean as a whistle. Too clean. She tried contacting his former clients. Some remembered him fondly. Others never responded. One woman, who hired Rick in 2007, described finding a knife buried behind a wall after he finished their remodel. Another mentioned her missing cat. But none of it was concrete. In 2011, the case file was updated. Person of interest, unlocated. It stayed that way. But back in the summer of 2008, before suspicion settled in, Rick had woven himself deeply into the Halberts' lives. He was in their kitchen, their basement, their yard. He knew their routines, he watched, he waited. And he left nothing behind, except a name, a truck no one could trace, and a trail that vanished into thin air. 16 years is a long time for silence to settle into a place. Dust thickens, paint cracks, and the world moves on. But some stories wait just beneath the surface, buried in shadows and wood and silence. Detective Dana Wilkes had retired in 2020, 4 years before the call that would bring everything back. When the department reached out, she didn't hesitate. She hadn't expected resolution. Few cold cases get that lucky. But this house, this family, had haunted her for over a decade. The Halberts weren't just another missing persons file. They were the ones that never added up. At the crime lab, she stood in front of the 4 bags laid out on sterile metal tables. Skeletal remains, carefully catalogued. 2 adult bodies, 1 adolescent, 1 child. The forensics team had already started their analysis. The bones were dry, brittle, but intact. Initial assessment placed the time of death around late summer 2008, consistent with the Halberts' disappearance. It wasn't enough for formal identification, not yet, but then they found the bracelet. It was a silver charm bracelet with 3 small pendants, a school bus, a paintbrush, and a letter C. Tarnished but intact. Chloe Halbert had worn it in every school photo. Her teachers remembered it. Her mother had once mentioned it during the investigation. Dana held it in her gloved hands and knew. This wasn't just evidence. This was the echo of a little girl who had once drawn monsters in the margins of her math homework. Then came the autopsy results. The first adult skeleton, presumed to be James, showed clear signs of blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. A deep fracture, likely caused by a heavy object, possibly a hammer. The break was clean, fatal. The second adult, most likely Lynn, showed no visible injuries. No broken bones, no signs of a struggle. Her arms had been folded across her chest, almost carefully. Cause of death, undetermined. The adolescent remains, assumed to be Tyler, showed a hairline fracture on the wrist, possibly defensive. His ribs were cracked, possibly from being compressed, or from a fall. There were no sharp force injuries, no gunshot wounds. And then there was Chloe. Her bones were the most fragile. No trauma, no fractures. Her tiny hands were curled inward, as if she'd been clutching something. Traces of a thin fabric were found around her remains, maybe a blanket, maybe a favorite shirt. Something comforting. 4 lives, silenced. Back at the house, the forensics team continued combing the kitchen. Beneath the floorboards, in the crawl space where the bodies were found, they discovered scattered personal items, a cracked photograph of the family, the corner of a journal, broken ceramic, possibly from a dish or decorative piece. But the most disturbing find was a set of 4 nails, rusted and bent, driven into the subfloor just inches from the bodies. They were placed in a square formation, almost ritualistic. Investigators weren't sure what to make of it. A sign? A message? A boundary? Dana wasn't quick to jump to theories, but something felt deliberate, not just about the nails, but the way the bodies had been arranged. It wasn't random. It wasn't rushed. Whoever did this had time, control, maybe even a twisted sense of closure. The house was sealed again. Megan and Travis were relocated temporarily, traumatized and shaken. Their renovation had stopped, likely for good. The media began to stir, old reporters dusting off archived footage, local stations revisiting the original case. Photos of the Halberts reappeared on television, the family frozen in a moment before everything unraveled. Dana sat alone in the station conference room late that night, staring at the file she never thought she'd reopen. She flipped through the old notes, the statements, the photographs. Then she added the latest report, closing the folder with slow, steady hands. They didn't run, she whispered. They were buried. And now, after 16 years, the dead had started to speak. The rain had been steady for days when Megan returned to the house. She hadn't wanted to. Every instinct told her to stay away, to leave it to the police, the city, the headlines. But something about the place pulled at her, a morbid gravity that made her feel responsible, as if she'd stepped into someone else's tragedy and couldn't step back out. Travis had gone in first. They'd been given limited access to retrieve personal items. The kitchen was sealed, of course, so was most of the downstairs, but the upstairs and parts of the rear hallway had been cleared for entry. She moved slowly, her steps echoing off the hollow floors. Each creak a reminder that this house had kept too many secrets for too long. Near the back of the house, behind what used to be the laundry room, Travis called out, "There's something here." She found him kneeling by a wall where a set of shelves had been removed during demolition. Behind them was drywall, but not like the rest of the house. This panel was newer, cleaner, out of place, and directly behind it something didn't sit right. The wall sounded hollow. Too hollow. "We didn't notice this before," he said, voice low. "It's like someone covered it up." They debated for a minute whether to touch it, to call someone, but curiosity won out. Travis fetched a small crowbar from the tool bin they'd left behind and began carefully prying at the edge. The panel gave way slowly. Dust spilled out in a cloud, and with it the stale, sour smell of something long forgotten. Behind the drywall was a narrow, descending passage, concrete stairs leading into darkness. There were no lights, no railings, just stone walls, chipped and wet. It wasn't part of any blueprint they'd seen. Megan's breath caught. "This wasn't a basement," she whispered. "It's a room, a hidden one." They called Dana Wilkes immediately. Within hours, the house was surrounded again. This time, the discovery was worse than bones. The hidden room was small, no more than 10 feet by 12. Concrete walls, a low ceiling, and a single dangling wire where a bulb used to be. Dust layered everything. In one corner, a rusted cot sat slumped, mattress rotted to its springs. Children's toys were scattered across the floor, blocks, a headless doll, a broken truck. And against the far wall, smeared in what looked like faded red paint, were 4 vertical lines, crudely drawn and interrupted halfway down. Like someone had started counting and never finished. But it was what lay beside the cot that stunned everyone. A small water-damaged notebook, its pages curled and stuck together, wrapped in a disintegrating cloth. It was delicate, but legible in places. Handwriting small, round, careful. The first page was dated August 1st, 2008. The name written in the corner, Chloe Halbert. Dana held it with a reverence she rarely afforded evidence. They photographed every page, scanned it into digital record. As the pages dried and separated, fragments of thought emerged. Innocent, nervous, confused. "Mom says we'll go soon. Tyler is mad. He doesn't talk to me. There's banging at night. Dad says it's just Rick working late." And then later, "Rick came again. Mom told him not to. He smiled too long. They argue a lot. Tyler yelled today. Mom said to hide the drawings." Each entry was short, scattered, with childlike spelling and crossed-out words. But as the days passed, the tone darkened. One entry near the end was smudged, almost illegible. "He said we're not leaving." That line repeated page after page like a mantra or a warning. For Dana, the journal changed everything. This wasn't just a case of disappearance anymore. Someone had held power here. Someone had created fear. And somewhere in that small, cold room, a child had tried to record the truth, not knowing if anyone would ever read it. 16 years later, they finally did. The notebook lay open on the evidence table under a soft light, its pages flattened carefully, piece by piece. Chloe's handwriting was uneven but determined, like she was writing faster than her hand could keep up. The entries weren't daily but came in clusters, some short and cryptic, others longer, filled with details that twisted in the stomach. August 3rd. Dad told me to stop drawing Rick. He said it's rude, but Rick smiles weird. August 4th. I heard yelling in the basement. Mom said to stay upstairs. August 6th. Tyler said Rick's truck was outside last night, but no one knocked. I looked through the curtains. He was standing by the back door. There were pages with crude sketches, stick figures, floor plans, symbols Chloe likely copied from somewhere else. In one, 4 figures stood around a 5th that lay down. The names Mom, Dad, Tyler, and me were written above the upright ones. The 5th had no name. Dana stared at that drawing for a long time. But it was the later entries that gripped everyone. They were scattered across torn pages, interrupted thoughts, smudges. Chloe wasn't just chronicling her fear, she was trying to warn someone, anyone. August 7th. Rick said we can't leave. Mom cried after. Tyler said he'll get help, but the door won't open. August 8th. There's a smell in the basement. I don't go down there. August 9th. Mom made me sleep in her room. She locked the door. The entries began to shrink, written in tighter lines, as if Chloe was trying to fit as much as she could in the smallest space possible. Her language got simpler, and her drawings darker. August 10th. Rick said we're going to stay forever. August 11th. Tyler yelled at Dad. Then there was a bang. I didn't see. That word bang appeared again 2 pages later, this time circled several times in dark pencil. August 12th. Mom told me to be quiet. She gave me food and my blanket and said to hide if I heard him. I think she's scared. I heard a bang again. August 13th. No one came to get me. From that point on, the pages grew messier. Chloe wrote on the backs of older drawings between margins, in spirals across corners. The pencil marks were faint, shaky. August 14th. Still quiet. I don't want to be here anymore. One final entry stood alone on the last usable page. He said we're not leaving. Nothing more. No date, no signature. Just that sentence, repeated once again in large, uneven letters. Diana sat in silence after reading it. So did the others in the room. It wasn't just a diary. It was a voice calling out from the dark, a record of fear, helplessness, and a child's attempt to make sense of horror. Forensics confirmed the handwriting matched earlier samples from Chloe's schoolwork. The notebook had been buried under debris in the hidden room for years. Mold had eaten through parts of it, but what remained was chilling and damning. Investigators began to cross-reference the entries with what they knew. The dates aligned with when neighbors last saw the family. The mention of Rick's truck, the sounds in the basement, the sudden shift in family dynamics, it all pointed to something far more orchestrated than previously believed. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It had a timeline, a pattern. But the most important revelation wasn't just about when or how, it was about intent. Chloe's words suggested confinement, control. Someone was keeping them there, watching, deciding who could speak, who could move, who could leave. And they never did. As the investigation deepened, Dana couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe had known more than anyone had ever imagined, that her quiet observations, her drawings, her final words weren't just desperate, they were deliberate, not cries for help, but a map. And if the team followed it closely enough, it might still lead somewhere they hadn't looked. The search for Rick Morales reignited like a fire starved of oxygen. With Chloe's journal entries corroborating suspicions of confinement and violence, he was no longer just a person of interest. He was a suspect in a quadruple homicide. But finding him was another matter. The police had tried before. In the months following the Halbert disappearance, Rick had already gone underground. No active phone lines, no forwarding address, bank accounts drained. He didn't just vanish, he erased himself. Investigators had assumed he'd skipped town or changed identities. But now, with renewed urgency, every old thread was pulled. One lead came from a tip line. A retired state trooper, now living in northern Wisconsin, recalled a strange man who had rented a cabin deep in the woods back in 2010. Paid cash, kept to himself, drove a red truck with no plates. He stayed for a few weeks, then disappeared just as quietly. Left behind a mattress, food cans, and a box of tools. The cabin's owner had never reported it. Just thought the man was off. When shown an old photo of Rick, the trooper hesitated, then nodded. Could have been him. A team was dispatched. The cabin, still standing but weathered by years of snow and silence, was abandoned. The door had been sealed with chains. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and decay. The walls were covered in mold, and raccoons had torn through what remained of the furnishings. But in the corner closet, behind a false panel, detectives found a blood-stained tarp wrapped tightly and buried under old lumber. DNA testing was expedited. The results came back with a partial match. James Halbert. His blood, long dried and degraded, was identified through familial comparison with relatives. It was a break no one expected. The presence of his blood, alone, outside the house, changed the narrative. Either James had been moved after death, or he hadn't died in that house. A deeper forensic sweep of the cabin uncovered remnants of burnt fabric, scorched plaster, and small metal buttons embedded in the ashes, possibly from children's clothing. But no additional remains, no fingerprints, just blood, just ghosts. The lead investigator noted signs of a small fire in the cabin's hearth, as if someone had tried to destroy evidence. It hadn't been enough. Still, Rick was nowhere to be found. They pulled his financials again, nothing new, no credit cards, no digital traces, social media accounts inactive for over a decade. His name never appeared on a lease, employment file, or utility bill after 2009. It was as if he had stepped off the map and wanted it that way, but they did find something else. Old records from his contracting company included names of former employees. Most had moved on, changed careers, but one stood out. Darren Cole, a part-time worker who had been hired during the Halbert renovation and had disappeared from employment records shortly after the family vanished. Darren had a petty criminal background, vandalism, minor assault, but nothing violent enough to raise flags back then. He was never interviewed in the original investigation. Now his name was back on the list. Detectives tracked him to a rundown apartment in Joliet. He was thin, jittery, and visibly startled when confronted. He denied knowing anything at first, claimed Rick hadn't paid him enough to stay long. But the more they pressed, the more cracks appeared. Under pressure, Darren admitted something chilling. He'd helped Rick clean up after something went wrong. He didn't say what. He didn't ask. He claimed he was told it was a family fight and that it got out of hand. He said Rick offered him cash, silence, and a threat: "If you talk, you'll end up like them." When asked who them was, Darren didn't answer. But the look in his eyes said enough. His statement placed Rick at the Halbert house after the last known sighting. It confirmed Rick had returned, that someone else had helped. That the story wasn't as isolated or as buried as it once seemed. Now the case wasn't just about finding Rick. It was about discovering what else, who else, had been hidden beneath the surface all along. The revelation from Darren Cole cracked open something that had long remained sealed. If Rick Morales wasn't acting alone, and if others knew, then there had to be more signs, more messages. More traces that had been missed or buried, either by time or design. Dana Wilkes returned to the house with a fresh set of eyes. She walked through each hallway slowly, not as a detective, but as someone listening. Listening for what had been silenced. It was in the kitchen that something caught her attention. A section of drywall just above the pantry door had been patched unevenly, slightly textured. Unlike the rest, it didn't match the original work. A forensic team was brought in to examine it. Behind the drywall, they found a small square of wood, stained and brittle. Etched into its surface, deep, desperate grooves were 6 words. "Save them. He's not who says." The message was fragmented but clear. It wasn't graffiti. It wasn't random. It was carved deliberately, with a steady hand, likely using something sharp, maybe a kitchen utensil. The handwriting analysis, cross-referenced with school forms and old notes, strongly suggested Lynn Halbert. This changed everything. Lynn hadn't been passive. She hadn't been caught off guard. She'd known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to try to leave behind something more lasting than a cry for help. A truth carved into a wall, because she knew words might not survive. Dana traced back the timeline. The message had to have been written after the arguments with Rick began, and before the family disappeared. That window was narrow. It placed Lynn in a mental space not of panic, but of strategy. She was warning someone. But who? Dana suspected she was speaking to her children, maybe to James, maybe to anyone who might someday find what the walls were hiding. But the phrasing, "he's not who says," lingered. The omission of a word. A mind racing under pressure. Lynn had run out of time. The investigative team expanded the search to the surrounding neighborhood. If Rick had worked on other homes, maybe he'd used similar tactics, sealing, hiding, building structures that weren't on any blueprint. The house across the street had once belonged to a widow who had moved out in 2012. When questioned, she recalled something odd. A crawl space Rick had insisted needed reinforcement during unrelated drywall work. The current owners allowed an inspection. Inside the crawl space, behind insulation boards, was an old black duffel bag. It contained a hammer with a worn rubber grip, a faded rag, and a notebook filled with measurements, dates, and notes in shorthand. Many of the pages were covered in grease and dust, but on one torn sheet, dated August 5, 2008, were the words, J.H., starting to ask too much. L, might crack, watch her. T, out of control. C, always watching, silent. The initials matched the Halbert family. It wasn't proof, but it was intent. Rick had been documenting them, not just the work, them, their behaviors, their reactions. He was studying the family he would eventually silence. The house next door offered a final, chilling connection. A neighbor, now in her 70s, said she'd heard screams once, just once during the summer of 2008. But she didn't call the police. She said Rick came to her door later that day smiling, holding a small basket of peaches from his garden, said the Halberts were playing loud again. She never questioned it. "I should have said something," she whispered. "People don't want to see horror when it's across the street. They want to believe it's a misunderstanding, a family fight, a renovation accident, not a prison, not a murder." But the signs had been there. Dana stood once more in the Halbert kitchen, now stripped to beams and silence. She looked at the spot where the message had been carved. She imagined Lynn standing there, pressing metal into wood, hoping the future would someday listen. 16 years too late, someone finally had. When the investigation reopened, most of the neighborhood watched quietly. Some with curiosity, others with guilt. But as media coverage deepened and questions resurfaced, more began to speak, often about things they hadn't thought important at the time or didn't want to admit. One neighbor, Kenneth Rowley, had lived 2 doors down from the Halberts for over 20 years. In 2008, he'd been outside watering his lawn when he noticed Rick Morales standing near the Halberts' garage, talking to someone inside. Rick was laughing, but something about the interaction felt off. Kenneth had always thought Rick was too comfortable around the property, like he belonged there more than the family did. He told detectives he later heard shouting, muffled but urgent, coming from the back of the house that same evening. He assumed it was a family argument. "Didn't seem like my place to interfere," he said. Another neighbor, Tasha Reed, shared a memory that had lingered in the back of her mind. A few days after the Halberts went silent, Rick came to her door. He offered to clear out her basement for a low price, said he was done with the job across the street and had time for side work. She declined. But what struck her later was that he never mentioned the Halberts by name. Just the job. 2 blocks over, a former mail carrier recalled that mail had piled up rapidly at the Halbert residence in early August 2008. He had made a note to report it, but before he could, he received a call from someone claiming to be James Halbert. The man asked to have mail held while the family was traveling. The voice had been strange, flat, almost rehearsed. He reported it to his supervisor. No follow-up was ever done, and then there was the Wilkins couple. They had moved in just a year before the Halberts vanished. At the time, they were renovating their home too, and had also hired Rick Morales briefly for floor work in the den. They described him as polite, skilled, but oddly nosy. He asked too many questions about their schedules, who lived with them, whether they traveled often. After 2 days, they let him go. What no one realized at the time was how consistent the pattern was. Rick would insert himself. Learn the space, learn the people, then linger, observe, adjust. He made himself useful, irreplaceable, and in doing so, he collected power. Back at the Halbert house, Dana reviewed all this with growing clarity. Rick hadn't just stumbled into this, he'd planned it. He chose his victims not randomly but methodically. He inserted himself into a home already vulnerable, financial strain, personal tension, isolation. He built trust, then used it as leverage. The collective memory of the neighborhood began to shift. What had once been dismissed as forgettable now seemed pivotal. Every odd moment, every too long stare, every silence that went unchallenged. And perhaps the most damning came from a man named Marvin Ellis, who had worked part-time for Rick in 2007. He was never questioned in the original case, having left the company months before the Halbert job, but after seeing the news, he contacted the police. Marvin said Rick once bragged about having a golden job coming up. Real private folks, no nosy neighbors, full access. When Marvin pressed for details, Rick smiled and said, "When you know how to look invisible, you can do anything." Marvin hadn't thought much of it back then. Now, he couldn't sleep. The investigators documented every testimony, every lead, every flicker of memory. The image that emerged was no longer just about a missing family. It was about a predator embedded in plain sight. Someone who used charm as a weapon, tools as cover, silence as a shield. Rick Morales didn't just kill, he prepared. And in a neighborhood that prided itself on being quiet, safe, ordinary, that preparation went unnoticed for far too long. The evidence was mounting, but one thing remained unclear. Had Rick Morales truly acted alone? Forensic analysis of the hammer found in the duffel bag revealed something unexpected. 2 sets of fingerprints. One partial match belonged to Rick, the other belonged to Darren Cole. When confronted with the results, Darren didn't deny it. In fact, it seemed to shake something loose in him. The truth had been buried for 16 years, and now, with Rick presumed dead or vanished, Darren began to speak, not just to avoid charges, but to be rid of the weight. He said the job had started normal, basic floor work, some framing. But by midsummer, he sensed something was off. Rick began excluding him from parts of the project. He would lock doors, make late-night trips, and talk less and less. Then one day, Rick showed up with blood on his shirt. Darren had panicked, but Rick calmed him with chilling clarity. He said it was handled, said they were all still there, just quiet. Darren claimed he was brought into the house the day after. He didn't see the family, just the aftermath. The floorboards in the kitchen had been pulled up. Rick told him they were starting fresh. He handed Darren a mask, gloves, and a hammer, said he needed help with the frame. It was only after Darren saw the outlines in the dirt, the curve of a spine, a child's shoe half buried, did he realize what had actually happened. He froze. "I didn't know what to do," he told investigators. "I wanted to leave. He said I couldn't." According to Darren, Rick never expressed guilt. He spoke in measured tones like it was all part of a plan. He claimed the family had gotten in the way, that James had tried to back out, to take the kids and run, that Lynn was going to tell someone, that Chloe had seen too much. Rick didn't see them as people anymore. He talked about them like they were an obstacle. Darren stayed just long enough to help cover the remains, reseal the floor, and clean the visible mess. Then he left and never returned. Rick paid him in cash, No one saw them together again. For years, Darren convinced himself that if he stayed silent, it would all fade, that Rick would disappear. That maybe, just maybe, it wasn't as bad as he remembered, but it was worse. Darren's confession, though incomplete and self-serving, provided critical pieces to the timeline. It confirmed Rick's presence at the house after the Halberts were last seen. It proved the burial was intentional, planned. And it introduced the chilling possibility that James might have still been alive, however briefly, after the others were gone. When asked directly, Darren hesitated. "I think he fought," he finally said. "I heard yelling. Rick said something about shutting him up." That simple phrase confirmed what Dana had suspected. James Halbert had tried to protect his family and died doing it. Darren was arrested for obstruction of justice and as an accessory after the fact. His cooperation bought him a deal, but not absolution. He would serve time, not for the killings, but for everything he didn't do to stop them. The public outcry was swift. News stations ran headlines branding Rick as a monster and Darren as a coward. Forums filled with debates about moral responsibility, fear and complicity. But in Dana's mind there was no question. One man killed them, she said, but another helped hide them. And that silence, it killed them again. As the case approached trial phase with Darren preparing to testify under oath, the full picture of that summer began to form, not just in reports and evidence, but in the memories of those left behind. The Halberts weren't forgotten. Their story, once buried beneath a kitchen floor, had forced itself back into the light. And the truth, no matter how delayed, was finally being spoken aloud. The final days of the Halbert family were reconstructed slowly, each memory, document, and confession acting as a brushstroke in a devastating portrait. What emerged wasn't a random crime, but a collapse, engineered from the inside by someone who knew exactly where the fault lines were. James had started to suspect something was wrong weeks before the end. His financial troubles had worsened. A second notice from the bank arrived. The house was halfway remodeled, but the budget was exhausted. And Rick, the one man James had trusted to help finish the job, had begun showing up uninvited, staying late, talking to Lynn when James wasn't home. According to Darren Cole's testimony and Chloe's journal, James confronted Rick sometime around August 10th. There had been shouting. Dana believed this was the moment the plan began to take shape. Rick must have realized the family was slipping out of his control. James wanted to leave, maybe even go to the police. He spoke with Lynn about pulling the plug on the renovation, packing up the kids and starting fresh elsewhere. But they were already too entangled. Rick wasn't just their contractor anymore. He was a constant presence, unavoidable, familiar, and increasingly dangerous. That night, James told Lynn to pack bags for the kids. He withdrew what little cash they had left. He left the security system disabled, intending to fix it the next day. And he asked Tyler to watch over Chloe while they slept. But they never made it out. At some point in the early morning hours of August 11th, Rick entered the house. Darren believed he had a key. There were no signs of forced entry. What happened inside remains partly unknown, but the physical evidence paired with the testimonial fragments allowed investigators to reconstruct the horror. James was attacked first, a blow to the back of the head. He may have been facing away, checking the back door or standing in the kitchen. The injury was clean, immediate, but not silent. Tyler likely heard it and rushed in. There were signs of a struggle, damage to a chair, a shattered plate. Tyler fought, possibly with a tool, before being overpowered. His wrist showed defensive wounds. He died with cracked ribs, possibly from being held down or pushed. Lynn's cause of death remained unclear, but her placement, arms folded, no trauma, suggested something deliberate. Dana believed she had been forced to witness what happened to her family before being killed, perhaps by suffocation or poison. Darren had hinted that Rick needed her quiet, not messy. Chloe, the youngest, had been kept separate, hidden. The blanket, the drawings, the tight corners of her final journal entries, everything pointed to Lynn trying to shield her. Chloe likely survived longer than the others. She may have been confined in the hidden room beneath the stairs, left with her thoughts, her pencil, and the instruction to stay quiet. What she saw, what she understood, remained captured only in those final lines. He said, "We're not leaving." Rick tried to erase his presence after. He used tools to cover the graves, rebuilt the floor, cleaned the visible mess. He planned to burn the basement, Darren confirmed this, but ran out of time or nerve. Instead, he locked everything in and walked away. He was never seen again. Dana stood in the empty kitchen, now stripped to its framework, imagining the silence that had followed. The eerie stillness of a house that had become a tomb. She realized the house had become a vessel. Not just for bodies, but for memory, for secrets, and for survival, even if only in whispers, journals, and messages scratched into drywall. The Halberts were not forgotten, and their final moments, once hidden, had now been reclaimed, piece by piece. What remained was accountability and closure. The news broke nationwide the day Darren Cole entered federal custody. Video footage showed him walking into the courthouse, head down, flanked by officers. The community watched in stunned silence. Some were angry, others relieved, most were just heartbroken. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was the validation that something terrible had happened right in their neighborhood, and that for years it had gone unanswered. Darren's confession gave prosecutors just enough to build their case. Though he wasn't the killer, he had helped conceal the crime. He had remained silent, cashed the money, and walked away. His cooperation earned him reduced sentencing, but he would still serve time. For the Halberts, justice would begin, not with vengeance, but with truth. Rick Morales, meanwhile, was declared legally dead. No sightings, no financial activity, no known alias ever surfaced. After nearly 2 decades, the law allowed for the presumption. The body was never found, but the evidence left behind, the fingerprints, the DNA, the journal, the eyewitness accounts, was overwhelming. The Halbert family was officially ruled as victims of homicide. The town held a memorial service at the local park. A small gathering of former neighbors, school teachers, and friends stood together beneath a gray sky, holding candles as photos of James, Lynn, Tyler, and Chloe were displayed on a board near the podium. A pastor read from Chloe's final journal entry, not the chilling repetition, but the softer line written days before. "Maybe someone will find us." Dana Wilkes was in the back, hands in her coat pockets, tears in her eyes. She hadn't worn her badge in years, but today she stood not as a detective, but as someone who had carried the weight of the unknown for far too long. After the service, the city offered Megan and Travis the option to relocate permanently. The house was deemed unfit, not structurally, but emotionally. It would never be just a home again. It was a grave, a crime scene, a memory sealed in floorboards and cement. They chose to leave. "I thought we were starting our life there," Megan said in a brief interview, "but it was never ours. It always belonged to them." The Halbert house was boarded up and later demolished. The land was left vacant, a small garden planted in its place. No plaque, no sign, just wildflowers and space for silence. For Dana, the closing of the case didn't bring joy. It brought stillness. She revisited every note, every drawing, every taped interview, then filed them away for the final time. She spoke at a conference months later, urging new detectives to always trust their instincts. "Just because a case grows cold doesn't mean the story's over," she said. "Some stories stay frozen, but when they thaw, they demand to be heard." In private, she lit a candle every August 12th, for the Halberts, for the lives interrupted. And for the question that still lingered like fog in the distance. If Rick was dead, where was the body? She didn't need the answer to move on, but part of her hoped that someday someone else would find that final piece. Just like Megan and Travis had found the floorboard, just like Chloe had found her pencil. Closure, after all, isn't silence, it's truth. Months after the case officially closed, something unexpected happened. A small publishing house in Illinois released a book titled Chloe's Room, A Daughter's Journal from the Dark. It wasn't a sensationalized true crime story or an investigative exposé. It was a careful, respectful reproduction of Chloe Halbert's journal, accompanied by commentary from child psychologists, trauma specialists, and a foreword written by Dana Wilkes herself. The book resonated deeply, not because it detailed a murder, but because it gave voice to a child who had tried in her own quiet way to be heard. Chloe hadn't been forgotten. Her words had outlived the silence that buried her. She wasn't just a victim, Dana wrote. She was a witness, a writer, a child who made sense of terror the only way she knew how, through pencil and paper. Readers responded. The book became a quiet bestseller, passed from hand to hand not for its horror but for its humanity. It appeared in classrooms, counseling offices, and book clubs. It sparked conversations about how children experience fear, how they observe what adults ignore, how their voices, however small, can hold the truth. Proceeds from the book were donated to a foundation created in the Halbert's name, the Chloe Fund, dedicated to supporting children in high-risk households. It offered school resources, emergency counseling, and a platform for anonymous reporting, especially in neighborhoods where problems are too often hidden behind white fences and trimmed lawns. The foundation hosted its first community event the following spring. Megan and Travis attended, along with Dana and several of the Halberts' surviving relatives. It wasn't a memorial. It was a celebration of art, resilience, and the power of being seen. Children were invited to draw. Blank journals were handed out. A wall displayed Chloe's original sketches, preserved behind glass. Some showed flowers, stars, and pets. Others revealed dark shapes, scribbled corners, shadows standing behind doors. A child's expression of truth, raw and unfiltered. A young girl walked up to the glass and asked her mother, "Did she draw this in the dark?" Her mother nodded gently. She did. Chloe's story began to appear in school safety programs. Her drawings were used in workshops on recognizing emotional distress. One teacher wrote, "She teaches more with these pages than I ever could with a lecture." For Dana, this legacy meant more than any courtroom verdict. It was the reason she'd joined the force in the first place, not to punish, but to protect, not to close files, but to open eyes. And so, in the city where silence had once swallowed a family whole, Chloe's voice echoed louder than ever. Megan later said the garden where the Halbert house once stood had become a place of peace for her. She would walk by, touch the gate, and feel, not haunted, but grounded. The flowers changed with the seasons. The wind carried faint whispers through the leaves. And every now and then a child would stop to pick a petal and ask a question. Questions were good. They kept the truth alive. At the next community gathering, Megan read aloud one of Chloe's last entries. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. "I think someone is watching," Chloe had written. "Maybe they'll find me." Megan paused, looked at the crowd, and whispered, "We did." In that moment, the past didn't vanish. It stood side by side with the present, transformed, remembered, and no longer ignored. Chloe Halbert's name was not just carved into paper. It had been etched into the hearts of thousands, and her voice, once written in shadows, now lived in the light. 2 years after the truth came to light, the lot where the Halbert home once stood remained untouched. No new construction, no real estate signs, just a modest garden watched over by a wrought iron fence. It wasn't a place of mourning. It had become something else entirely. People still came, not in droves, not like a tourist stop, but quietly, thoughtfully, survivors of domestic trauma, former neighbors, teachers, detectives, children with questions, parents with fears. Some left flowers, others left notes. A few just stood there, eyes closed, listening to the wind as it passed through the leaves. The garden had become sacred, not because of what happened, but because of what was found. Truth, resilience, and a voice that refused to disappear. There was no monument, no statue. The story had always been too fragile for stone, but in the far corner, just past a small cluster of wild daisies, a single wooden bench bore a carved inscription, "Maybe someone will find us." CH, and someone had. Detective Dana Wilkes, now fully retired, visited each August. She never brought anyone with her. She'd sit quietly, sometimes with a journal, sometimes with nothing but time. She had closed dozens of cases in her career, but this one stayed with her. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the one that demanded the most listening. She believed now more than ever that the smallest voices often hold the deepest truths. Chloe had taught her that, a child no one had heard in time, yet who had spoken anyway. Megan and Travis had relocated, started fresh. They didn't speak publicly about the house again, but in a rare letter to the local paper, Megan wrote, "The home we bought became a doorway. What we found inside it changed us. And we are honored forever to have been the ones who opened that floor." They never tried to explain the experience further. Some things aren't meant to be turned into lessons. Some are simply meant to be carried. In the years that followed, the Chloe Fund expanded to cities beyond Chicago. It helped children find help earlier. It trained school staff to recognize warning signs others missed. It gave voice to those too afraid to speak alone. And in one quiet corner of a middle school library, a girl once picked up Chloe's room and read the entire thing in one sitting. At the end, she closed the book, walked into the counselor's office, and asked for help. That was how the story continued, not in darkness, but in light. And now to you, the listener, thank you for staying with this story, for following every detail, for honoring the voices that were once buried. Stories like this remind us how much can go unseen, how much silence can weigh, and how sometimes the truth is waiting, beneath floorboards, behind walls, or in the corners of forgotten rooms, just for someone to listen. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel. We tell stories that deserve to be remembered, stories that were hidden, silenced, or nearly lost. And if you're ready for another true mystery that will keep you thinking long after it ends, click on the video suggested on your screen now, because the past is never truly gone, it's just waiting to be found.